around the quality of evidential practice. And that was, we have Jane Lewis from the Centre for Evidence and Implementation as one of those chairs today, Sheffield Hallam, Renesi, we had Save the Children, the Old Fire Station in Oxford as one of the practitioner partners, and Dartington Service Design Lab, and a few others that came together to say, look, how do we see those challenges, and to define a kind of problem statement, if you like, that we then commissioned some work to look at. And I guess the 2 or 3 themes that emerged from those discussions that we had in shaping the brief for this work is, one, that it depends on the vantage point that you're at, who you are in relation to this work. And in that, we wanted to look at the perspectives of the different, whether you're somebody in government, whether you're somebody who's in different levels of government, whether you're somebody in communities, and to understand how those different vantage points really informed how you looked at evidence and what you needed to wanted to look at. We also reflect on the fact that it's a very emergent space, and that there was the kind of first question was, what is this work, depending on the way in which you're doing it. And until we kind of understood that question of what is place-based work, and therefore how does that inform the way that we understand the value of it, then it was going to be difficult for us to move this on. And you'll see from the work that John is going to introduce, and hopefully you've had a chance to have a look at, that was the kind of first stop, if you like, on the question, the way that we tackled the question. So the format for today is that we're going to, I'm going to hand over to John Hitchin in a moment to present work, and he's going to sort of take you through the kind of key elements of it, so you're kind of well versed on that. We're then going to ask 3 people, who I'll introduce when we get to that point in a bit more detail, to reflect on, from their perspective, on the report, the value of the work, and how they see it kind of in the context of what they do, and then how we take that work forward. Then we're going to go into a Q&A, and we've got there's a Q&A function. Hopefully you'll find, depending on how fair you are with Zoom, but if you can put the questions you'd like to put to John and the other panelists in the Q&A as we go forward, we'll come back to those questions at that point. We've also opened the chat function, so you're very welcome just to share thoughts, reflections as we go through the session today, as well as we'll be looking to the Q&A function to pick those to pick the actual questions up at the end. So if you can use that, and also I think you could probably you can vote them up if they're particularly ones that you want to make sure that we do ask. And then at the end, we're going to ask you to participate a little bit. So we're going to do a Slido that's just going to ask for your opinions on how you'd like to see, what's the value of the work in the context of your role, your organisation, and your perspective on this, and then what you would like to see happen next, because as you will see, this is a kind of start of something rather than the end of it, and there's a lot to do still in order for us to take it forward. So hopefully, if that's okay, we're going to I'll hand over to John to take us through the presentation.
Thanks, Jo, and hello everybody. Really nice to be here. So just before I get going, a couple of things to say. First of all, huge thanks to Jo and the Place Matters team for commissioning this and for thinking this through and taking on the role as a sort of infrastructure field building organisation for place-based work in the UK. I think it's so essential that we have one, as will probably become relevant as I talk through what we've done. And then the second thing to say is I'm presenting today, but this is very, very much a collaborative piece of work between myself, my business partner Anna Waldy, and Michael Little from Ratio. Michael is on a different time zone right now, so he couldn't join us. So you've just got me today, but very much it's not just me who's done this work. And then the final thank you is to the stewardship group that Joe mentioned. The kind of input and feedback and reflection from that group was really valuable in improving the quality of this work. So what I want to do today is talk you through what we've done. And I'm not going to be able to do all of it, but I will just expand that screen and do that. Hopefully this is working. I want to talk through what we've done, which is a taxonomy of the work. I'm hoping everyone can see that. Please shout if you can't, because it's done that thing where I can't now see you. And for those of you who haven't seen it, this is the headline of this is the front cover of the report. It was one of those things that where you've been working on it in Word for such a long time that when someone actually designs it up for you, you're like, oh yeah, this is good. And the design has been a really big part of that. So what I want to start with is that question that Joe posed, which is the sort of starting point for that stewardship group and what they were interested in, which was what's the kind of evidence that people who lead, fund, or participate in this work, and what kind of evidence do they need? Because of that sense of conflicting priorities, conflicting, or maybe not always conflicting, but views and perspectives that are in tension. And how do you grapple with that? And how do you tell a story clearly and well about what place-based work is and does? And I suppose we started thinking about that from the way in which I've thought about it a lot in my career. Is that you go to some practice first, and you kind of use them to build up a sense of how they do it and what they do. But what we found as we started to do that was it was incredibly hard. And I say this as someone who's been part of and as guilty as anyone in writing some of these definitions, I found it very hard to actually define what it was we were really talking about when we were talking about place-based change. What did we really mean, so that we could then think about the kind of evidence that would be needed to support it? And we struggled. And so we felt that a lot of the definitions that we were looking at, and again that I'd written earlier in my career, were ones that were understanding the practice from the perspective of the places. Now, that obviously makes sense because it's place-based work. But actually what we found with that was it's very hard to then disentangle what the practice was. And so we tried to flip the approach that we were going to take and start with practice. But how do you start with practice without the places? Well, we looked at a lot of practice in places, and we tried to break down into what became 7 dimensions, what we felt were the things that defined whether this was place-based work and defined something about it. I'm not going to go into all of them here, but these 7 dimensions that are on the left of the screen were things where it defined the practice. So you had to be doing something that was across all 7 of these, but that you could make different choices in here. So you could do some place-based work working with the whole population of a place or with a subpopulation of that place. So there's a kind of population question. You could be doing place-based work that works almost entirely with state infrastructure, local government, bits of the public sector, or you could be doing place-based work that works almost exclusively with civil society, and some that works on the overlaps between those, but also the market and private sector infrastructure. You could be doing place-based work that was interested in human development outcomes, so place-based work to reduce child poverty, place-based work to end homelessness. Or you could be doing place-based work that doesn't really push at those human development outcomes, but pushes more at process outcomes on the journey towards that. So that could be systems that work better and more effectively. It could be things that drive up community control of an asset. So that's the control itself isn't the outcome, but the place-based work might be really going at that control because you believe that control of that asset, that local asset, and ownership of that local asset will lead to a whole range of other positive benefits for the community. So there's also a time frame, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, ongoing. And there's also things like the scale of impact, really trying to just improve outcomes or issues in a small block through to thinking about the relationship between neighborhood work and what's going on across a whole region, like some of the combined authorities are thinking about now. So we really broke down those dimensions and just started to codify practice that we saw. So this organization, they seem to do this, this, and this, and we kind of codified all of that. And what that gave us is then a whole group of, and I'm going to jump in this diagram from the dimensions on the left to the mechanisms in the middle. Because once we coded all of the like a whole bunch of practice, we started to see that there were patterns and that there were certain mechanisms of place-based change that were different to other ones. So if you were working in a self-defined place with the whole population in an ongoing way, and you're probably working with the social infrastructure of that place, that's very, very different to place-based work that's working with a subpopulation in a local authority defined administrative boundary on a 5-year program working on a very specific human development outcome. That they are both, according to our dimensions, place-based work, but you can see straight away that they're taking very, very different mechanisms. And I'll talk in a minute about what some of those mechanisms might be, but once we started doing that, we were finding lots of different mechanisms, many of which had names already given to them by existing evidence, existing approaches. And we also conjectured that there were probably a lot more than we were finding just in the examples that we were coding. And there were almost too many to do anything with. And so what we then tried to do is group those mechanisms into categories. So although this diagram goes dimensions, categories, mechanisms, the way in which we got there was dimensions to mechanisms and then group the mechanisms into categories. But in a way, each category, once we'd created them, is a bucket to sort of hold the mechanisms. And in doing that, we then looked at what's the evidentiary practice for those categories of work, and we started to see some patterns. And so what I want to just, before I get into any of the detail, what I want to say is that effectively what we've done with this piece of work is take a taxonomy approach of trying to build up with the mechanisms, like what is out there in the UK and a little bit internationally, and try and see how they're defined, see how this is similar to this one and different to this one, and taking an evidence base of things that are expressing themselves in the world approach. So that was a taxonomy. But then we kind of created a bit of a typology because we sort of conceptually grouped those mechanisms into our categories. So I like to think it's a taxonomy we've created because we were grounded in the evidence, but it is also the categories became the thing that we're talking about the most. And in a way, that's a typology of practice because it's conceptually defined. Because what we then did with that is to then think about the evidence against those categories because it was sort of easier for the scale of work that we were doing. And quite frankly, there isn't enough evidence for all of the mechanisms. And that allowed us to then start to answer that first question that we were asked by Place Matters in the Stewardship Group, which is actually what we're seeing is a lot of the conflicting views about evidence was something to do with the challenge of defining place-based work is and misunderstandings, and maybe someone was funding it thinking that it was going to be a bit like this, but actually the practice looked a little bit like this. And there's a lot of misalignment in evidence. And therefore, what we felt that the strength of this work could be would be to lead into this approach of categorizing the approach to place-based work and use that as the way to start thinking about evidence and build from that into the individual places. I'm going to talk more about these categories in a second, but I wanted to just start there because in a way, this one diagram, which is in the report, sort of shows how we answered this question. We went from dimensions of what was existing in the world and coded them against real examples to create mechanisms. We then conceptually grouped them into some categories. And then from those categories, we could start to see this is what's happening with evidence. And this is why it's been so hard to understand what's going on. But immediately, and this is going to come up quite a lot, there's some problems with that. So if you take those active dimensions at the bottom and you knit them together to create some mechanisms that I've just discussed, as soon as you then go to an actual place, an actual real place, rather than this kind of evidence-based conceptual space that I've been in so far, then in no one place are you just using one mechanism. in no one organization that thinks that they're taking a place-based approach do they neatly just use one mechanism. The reality of this work is that maybe in this, in this 3-year period, we're prioritizing this approach, but that approach is actually also highly dependent on these 4 organizations that are in the place that they're using a very different mechanism. And we're also dragging those mechanisms through the local history, politics, infrastructure, social capital. So as soon as you pull these mechanisms that we're describing back into places, then it gets messy again. And then you get straight into the challenge that instigated the question of, well, actually, if I'm doing good work in place A, how do I evidence it? And I think what we've tried to do is to sort of keep this work out of places, ironically, by saying there is good practice out there. The organization I used to work at, Renacy, have got an approach to evaluating place-based work that's based on some work in Australia. Collaborate, CIC, Place Matters themselves. Lots of other people have got, really good and thoughtful approaches to how you think about the mess of working in place A. But what we felt was, if we're going to build out this field of practice, we need to build out better evidentiary approaches for these mechanisms, so that when you're thinking about what's actually going on in place A, when you're back into that context, you can think, actually, we're using a collective impact backbone model here, really. And some of these other actors that we're working with are using a different model. And so we need to design our evidentiary approach that leans into the strengths of that model, and et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't solve all the problems. And this work poses as many questions as we think it answers. And we haven't fully answered that first question that the stewardship group set us. But what we do think is that this is an essential approach to help us build out a field of practice to be more useful, to start to answer those bigger questions of when a policymaker wants to understand how can they justify place-based approaches rather than standard siloed programmatic approaches. How do we start to build that conviction of the quality of this across a field of practice? We think you need to use this approach. So we think that what this work does is gives the starting point for a language, a way of understanding, a way of thinking about how change happens. And it helps us then start to think a little bit more clearly about, well, how is it currently evidenced? It is not, this work at the moment, our view at all on quality or value of different approaches or what's good. There is more to be done in that space. And so, I've had lots of interesting conversations in the process of doing this and since publishing, where people are asking the next level of question down. We're not saying that mechanism A is better than mechanism B. We're saying, if you use mechanism A, these are maybe some of the things you need to think about. So this taxonomy is something which we believe can help move the field on by kind of giving some shared understanding and evidence of what's happening currently. There's lots more that we want to do and that other partners want to do off the back of this.
John, just before we go on, I think is it possible to put this on presenter mode? I think you've got it on slide mode, just so people can see the detail on your slides. I don't know if there's a different button you can press.
Well, it was
Perfect, and the expert in which one it might be, but
yeah, I thought I had it because it was on presenter mode for me.
give it another try.
If you've got 2 screens, John, you might need to swap what's showing on each screen. Are you using 2 screens?
Yeah.
You don't need the presenter notes, John. You might just be able to share it as slide mode.
That better?
That is perfect.
Perfect. Okay. Sorry about that, everyone. I was under the impression that that's what I've been doing the whole time, so apologies for that. So yeah, what this taxonomy is then is a codification of what's happening. As I said to you earlier, when I kind of said the approach that we've taken, we ended up with 5 categories, and we absolutely have we've come up with these. So whilst we think that the mechanism are based on practice that we've seen, we think the categories are our approach to kind of pulling it together and telling this story. And we tried so many different ways of cutting up this cake of mechanisms, but the one that we came to was this, and it really unlocked something for us, which is thinking about. So in the black, these are different mechanisms. There are many more mechanisms that are on here. These are just here to be illustrative. But the lines that sit above the black boxes are categories. And what we broadly found was that over to the left-hand side of the page, you've got things that are more led by civil society, and to the right-hand side, it's approaches that are mechanisms that are more led by state. Towards the top, you've got things that typically try to see a smaller geographic scale as their intended impact, and towards the bottom, you've got a larger, maybe more like regional or state scale of impact. Now, what that doesn't mean is that the work is all at regional scale. You could have, in what we call a market intervention approach, I think of some of the work that some of the combined authorities in the UK are looking at, like GM with Live Well. I would put Live Well in that kind of market intervention sort of category, because what it does is it's thinking about the region, but it's absolutely empowering very micro scale work, but it's then connecting the micro to the macro. So it's the intended scale of impact, not the intended scale of delivery, if that makes sense. And because a lot of place-based work, it's when you get to these bigger geographic scales, it's how you knit them together. And what that gave us was actually there's these 5 broad approaches, of which in the UK we think there's quite a lot of 3 or 4 of them. And I've just mentioned combined authorities. I think combined authorities are a growing example of the 4th. I'm not going to go through all of them in this presentation, but I just want to highlight a couple of things. So when you think about something like the continuous local social change one, which is our top left, what we're thinking about there is stuff that might not even be a charity or a formalized organization. It might be as well, but it's local people working together in their place, doing something that starts with maybe social action, and it's hyper local, and it can keep going. It can just keep going. There's no start and end point to it. And I'll talk in a second about some of the mechanisms to these things. And that feels like, and you'd evidence that, and you'd experience change in that in a very, very different way to something like the 3rd category, which we call state and civil society relations, where you're explicitly thinking about how does typically something innovative, it might be a new charity or a new social enterprise that does something to work with the local state and the local civil society to try something different on how we're going to end homelessness around here, or how are we going to pull together the assets of the local area and fix some of the flaws in the state system in a way that's collaborative and connecting. So a lot of the tradition in many other countries of things like backbone organizations and collective impact models, in our view, sit there, because it's that, how do we pull state and civil society together and rethink how this local system works around this problem? Backbones are one of them. There's some great examples in the UK of much more service-led innovations, some institution-led innovations. But that's where things like the new Office for the Impact Economy in the UK, I think a lot of their interest sits in that scale of work. That's different again to the civil society organizational change, which is things that sit more with organizations like those of you that know things that Platform Places are doing on high streets, local ownership of assets by communities, because it's how can the civil society organization identify assets, link leaders, network civil society. It's about anchor organizations in a place. It's a very, very different, again, understanding of change. All of them have value. All of them achieve different things. And therefore, going back to our initial question, all of them have different evidentiary approaches. So this is in the report. This is our kind of very, very shorthand, skipped one, shorthand description of those 3, of those 5. And in the report, there are some examples. There are many, many more examples than the ones that we put in the report. Many of you will think of others. The challenge with picking examples goes back to my earlier point, because no one organization is just one mechanism. So we put them in because we think they do something which exemplifies this mechanism. We're not trying to say that Grapevine is only doing continuous local social change, Grapevine in Coventry, because it is absolutely not. Grapevine in Coventry is doing a bunch of other things too. We just think it's a great example of where that organization came from, did some wonderful continuous local social change. It's now doing more. As soon as you try and use this mechanism, this taxonomy to like pinpoint and put somebody in a box, it breaks. Because we're not trying to say, oh, your organization is here and your organization here and your place is doing that. This is not the point of this work at all. And if you use it in that way, it breaks it. And it makes the work, the complex place-based work, reductive. What we believe the value of this is to give a framework to think about the field as a whole, and then to think about how we want to evidence the field as a whole. And that will then help the individual places and organizations think about, oh, actually, I sit here in this field a lot of the time. I could think more about these sorts of problems or work with these sorts of kinds of evidence. And in the diagram, in the report, we've got 5 of these diagrams, which is us trying to think about, and these are draft. Like there are lots of things in this report that are like, this is us starting. We are entirely sure that there are many things in this report that with further research we'll want to change, that somebody will challenge, that maybe if we do more research, we might end up with 6 categories, or we might, like, we are completely comfortable with that. Like, we hope that this gets used and becomes, and is adapted. But what we wanted to do was for each of the 5 categories is to give a broad sense of, well, how does this work? How does this mechanism, how do the mechanisms that sit within this category work? And so for the category 2 organizations, which is our local civil society led change, we think that there's different mechanisms. Some focus on physical assets, some focus on community leaders, some focus on networks. But all of them require the governance. So those 3 arrows come into the governance of an individual civil society organization. Could be an anchor organization, could be a community hub. You can probably picture the type of organization. That organization will do a lot of other things, but for this mechanism, if it's working well, it tends to do a lot of mapping and learning from residents. So it's pulling knowledge from the community about what's going on around here, what assets are there, both physical and social. It's also connecting other civil society organizations to this, like building that network. And it's thinking about the whole population to grow social assets. It tends to do that by building new processes, using relational approaches over sort of 3 to 5 year cycles. And that leads to process outcomes typically here around who owns and directs these resources, who is able to innovate and lead from a citizen, like which citizens are able to do that, and how can we create new types of leadership, and who gets to access public services, and how do we change the way in which groups that have particular levels of need get to access these services. Outside the box, you kind of hope that those things lead to specific human development outcomes, but we don't think that that's actually that important for the mechanism. The mechanism is all about this type of organization. And I can think of tons of wonderful organizations that do this kind of work. And what we want this taxonomy to do is to help funders, commissioners, policymakers, and practitioners to think, actually, this sounds exactly like what we need in our community. How do we do that well? How do we evidence that? How do we invest in that? How do we build out the practice of that? It's not to say organization X in community Y sits in this box. It's got to follow this, model. We're not trying to do that. We want to build out the field. So what's the value of this? We think it's a crucial piece of work. It's a crucial piece in increasing the supply of and demand for high quality place-based work. The thing that I think is so essential about the work of Place Matters is that field building role. Like, how do we drive up the quality of both supply and demand place-based work? You can't, right at the start of this process, somebody who runs a place-based organization said to me, place-based work is a flightless bird. You spend all your time throwing it up in the air again because the conditions don't support it. The conditions don't support it because we don't have enough supply and demand of high quality stuff. And you can't create the demand if you don't also articulate the supply. And so to me, it's a feedback loop that we're in, where if the people doing this work, all they say is, we're not getting enough money, then they'll never get any more money. It's got to be both about supply and demand at the same time. And we hope that this framework and this way of thinking is a piece in that jigsaw, but the work that Place Matters and many others are doing are other parts of that jigsaw. So what we want is to think, well, if this is a field of practice, of place-based working, and that maybe a couple of our categories fit very firmly in it, but there are some of them that as we were working on them, we were like, is this place-based work? Kind of not. There's lots of questions that by the time we finish this project, and we've got lots of ideas of what we want to do next, but by the time we finished it, we're like, there's so much more we could explore here. Because in the UK, we think for too long, place-based work has been the work of kind of heroic individuals and practices. It's like someone doing something brilliant, a funder taking a punt on a particular type of funding. And until we shift that to being a field of practice where you don't have to be a hero, because actually it's not a flightless bird, there's good flows of resource, there's clarity about what good looks like, there's infrastructure, there's all the things that other sectors and other fields of practice have. Till we get there, then you've always got to be a hero to make this work. You've always got to go above and beyond. And so what we hope is that this is part of that field building. I think that's my 25 minutes. So thank you all. There's so much more I could have said, but I hope that that's useful. I hope it encourages you, that if those of you that haven't read the report, to go and have a look at it. And what I would say is that I know that Place Matters want to do more with this. Members of the stewardship group are interested, but myself and Anna and Michael, we're also interested in carrying this conversation on. We all believe in what Place Matters are doing and the need of building a kind of really strong field of practice in the UK. So thank you, and sorry about the Zoom issue earlier.
Thank you very much, John. That was a very comprehensive, coherent take us through what is a really complex piece of work, actually, and it's one of those things that I think it's so ambitious in scope and trying to land sort of complexity of ideas, but it's from our own perspective, and I guess we've asked because we partly commission the work, but is that its value is that it kind of, I think, nails the differences we've all been grappling with between the different sort of ways in which this work presents itself. And in that, I think it may not be right, as you say, and I think it's important that we don't try and put an organisational lens on it. We're looking at putting a practice, a field lens on it, which is really important. We'll perhaps unpack really what that means in a bit more detail. The other thing I think is those mechanisms for change are incredibly important, because I think what they draw out is the things that we can really focus attention on. What are the things that we need to get really good at in order to drive change? And I think unpacking and that kind of discussion and that kind of lens going forward is going to be really important. And that's what one thing that we would want to be doing as Place Matters in developing this work going forward. What I wanted to do now is invite, we've got 3 panelists who we've asked to just, we're going to bring, I think, different perspectives to this work based on what they're involved with. We invited them just to really reflect on this work and perhaps more broadly on their take on the evidence and the shape of place-based practice, just to really get us all thinking about what in terms of how you're thinking about it. So it's a kind of by way of just oiling the wheels of your thinking. And please, as we said earlier, put your own sort of your own questions in the Q&A as we go forward, prompted by what hopefully our panelists are going to say. So we've got the 3 of us. By way of brief introduction, Sylvia Dewey is from Tamarack Institute in Canada, and we look at Tamarack Institute as Place Matters as kind of our big sister in this work in many ways, because it's they're 20 years in, a bit more now, I think, in terms of their journey of working in and around place-based change. And we're somewhat less than that, but because of that maturity of practice and perspective, Sylvia and colleagues, I think, have got a kind of playing the clock forward really on our own journey and understanding this work. So we're going to invite Sylvia just to share kind of where this work lands in the context of the more mature Canada place-based practice, but also what she and they have learned along the way around Hitchin's work. Lewis briefly mentioned earlier is from the Centre of Evidence and Implementation, who've been a real leader in place-based evidential practice and a supporter of this work. So Jane, I hope, will share a little bit around some of their broader thinking around this, but also how this framework might land in the context of evidential practice in the UK. And then finally, Steph O'Keefe is a colleague at Place Matters now, very glad to say, but also more recently was the programme director for the Right to Succeed Career Programme in North Birkenhead, and so we'll speak kind of from a practitioner perspective, but also from a Place Matters perspective. So I'm going to invite them just one by one to just share their reflections with us, and starting, Sylvia, if you wouldn't mind, with you.
Thank you, Jo. Thank you, everyone. John, wow. When I was thinking about sort of how to share insights, the first thing that came to mind, which I think you so humbly led with, is that notion. I think it's a British statistician, all models are wrong, but some are useful. This is so incredibly useful. And I just want to acknowledge and thank you and your team of colleagues and the folks at Place Matters for having the courage to undertake this effort, right? To really map and document the rich diversity of work that falls under this label of place-based change. It really helps to begin identifying important dimensions of place-based work and contribute. I think it'll set the stage to contribute to greater rigor in our collective understanding of these patterns and how they unfold. And I will say, Tamarack may have been around, we maybe have been doing some place-based work in our country predominantly for decades, but place matters, right? And there's some uniqueness to your context that I think, like, again, caution, right? What we've discovered may inform, but isn't necessarily the same truth as what exists here. I really appreciate how this typology has documented the key actors and the various types of contributions that are often present when working in a place. So often people come in, right, wanting to make positive change, and they are really focused on what they want to see happen and how they envision it happening. But rarely, if ever, do we step into a place that's a blank sheet with nothing already going on. And so I think part of the gift of the typology is it brings a rigor and a sense of robustness that you can bring to truly mapping out what's already happening, to, challenge and test local designs. And I think that reality of the rich network of activities and players that's already at play is really encouraged. I think when you've animated this thread of the interaction between the actors and the fluidness across the roles is really emphasized. The challenge with the graphics is if I'm someone not taking a deep dive and not having the benefit of the dialogue that we've just had, it could be easy to see them as discrete bits and somehow lose the greater whole. But I do think it can also be really useful in encouraging evaluations that take a developmental lens. So not only what's happened, but what hasn't happened or what unexpected things have happened. And now what are we learning about our understanding of this as a practice? Like, I think that foundation is really well established. And also, I think, could really support this notion of contribution analysis, right? We are not the only ones here. This is our contribution. This is our strength. So it might actually help different actors be really clear about who they are, what their contributions are, and invite those different players to ask some great strategic questions of themselves in terms of, this is our current role. Is this the role we want to stay in? And if not, how might we want to evolve? It might also be a useful framework to gather those different actors in a place, to do a collective mapping around, who are we? What do we have in place? Where are the gaps that we might want to intentionally choose to focus on together in the next sprint that we do? But also, where are the places that we're already working, and just knowing that create opportunities for us to be more intentionally aligned and mutually reinforcing in our work. Because I would say the one thing that we've certainly learned as we've helped and worked in places and with places is that the challenge of these complex issues is there's no one right way to get it done, right? And I think just giving people that assurance, but offering a framework to enable them to reach clarity together about what the next wise step is for them in this community is really, really helpful. And I think what we've learned is people always come to an issue, and in an effort to try and not be overwhelmed, they're looking for the one silver bullet solution, right? That's going to fix everything. And we all know that in reality, it's more like silver buckshot, right? There's like a whole suite of different activities that need to be happening. And the magic happens when they have mechanisms to loosely align and connect them toward greater shared impact. And so I think the one thing I struggled with a little bit, and maybe this is just me because I've geeked out quite a bit on the collective impact framework, is the notion of the backbone. We don't think about the backbone as an organization, actually, rarely. What we think about it is a necessary collaborative infrastructure and set of practices. And like a fractal where, what's happening at one scale kind of gets mirrored at different scales, I think there is a role for this kind of backbone infrastructure that allows us to pause and map and collectively align our work that needs to happen at various scales, and then to intentionally connect the work across scales in strategic ways, which are hard to predict, right? It really depends on where you're at, what you've achieved, that kind of stuff. But overall, really appreciate the presence of the framework and the rigor that it brings to mapping options and bringing more deliberateness to how we work and how we can continue to evolve our work. So thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. That was thought-provoking as ever, as we expected. I think just immediate reflection for me is just how helpful it is to look at that at a place level infrastructure as opposed to the practice of any individual organisation, because I think we're really thinking in the UK, and I'm sure we are in many other places, about the quality of infrastructure that enables communities to take action in the collective sense, the broadest sense. And I think looking at that mapping, I think, would be a really good way of testing the quality, the quality of the capacity for change in those communities. Thank you. Jane, let me invite you just to share some of your reflections.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Well, I just absolutely love this report. I think it's really brilliant. Jo suggested I might start by saying something about how the report resonates for me and with our work. And to me, it resonates like a bell, chiming with a clear, pure ring across the misty, mysterious, shape-shifting, emergent landscape that is the glory of place-based working. So I found it really illuminating. I find it very helpful in clarifying for myself where the work I've done, where the work that we do at CEI fits in this landscape. And it helped me to understand why I've sometimes had the experience of talking with somebody about place-based working, and particularly about evaluation and evidence as part of it, and find myself thinking, I've always thought of you as somebody who's incredibly wise and comes from the same schools of thought as me. And I'm finding I'm stridently disagreeing with absolutely everything you're saying. And heartily worrying about that. And that's the kind of tension that Joe referred to at the in opening. And so it's really helped me to see in what ways we're talking about different things when that happens. And the point I keep coming back to, which is really emphasized in the report, is that if your question is what evidence is needed to do and to understand place-based working, then your answer must be evidence that aligns with how you think change happens. So I really, really like the typology, and I particularly like it because it feels to me like it does what a really good typology will do, which is both describe and explain. So it describes the landscape of place-based working really well, but it does a terrific job at explaining why different evidence is needed for each one based on the different mechanisms of change. So it's made us think a bit about the work that we're doing at CEI at the moment and how those place-based projects fit. In the UK, we're doing the national evaluation of Thrive at 5, which is given as one of the examples of Group 3. It's an initiative that's working across the local system, public, private, voluntary system, encouraging prioritising of early years and of children's development by the time they start school, and attempting to develop a more comprehensive and integrated body of support. It has a very strong emphasis on empowering parents and centering parents in the work. And so although it is an example, a really good example of Group 3, I think it also has some of the sort of some little whispers of Groups 1 and perhaps also 2. The other two examples are both outside the UK. The first is the work that we're doing with Minderoo as strategic partner to their evaluation of their early years partnership, which is a 10-year programme where they're working with 4 communities and with the West Australia government. And again, that's an example of Group 3, although with very strong buy-in from government right from the start. And the evaluations of both of those involve quantitative measurement of change as well as very extensive implementation and process evaluation, looking at how change is experienced by children and families and services. It's a real privilege to be working with partners that bring the ambition and the integrity to want to test their models and look at the impact. But what's really important is that both of them are models where that's an appropriate approach to the evaluation. And there is absolutely no lack of ambition or integrity in other models that require very different forms of evidence to test and explore them. And an example of one of those is the work that we're doing in Norway, working with 4 municipalities funded by the Cavalli Trust, where we had a very different starting point with no intended outcome, except, our starting point was to go to the municipalities and say, can we help you to work out whether there might be one thing relating to children and families that you'd like to work on in your area? And so the evaluations, the evidence gathering for both of for that project is very different. I guess that one has features of perhaps Group 2 and 3, although we're working with municipalities rather than with civil society. But when I look across them, it seems to me that there's a key distinction there in whether and when and how an outcome is actually identified. And I wonder whether that might be something to bring into the thinking around the typologies. To me, the report raises 2 really fantastic challenges to us in our work. The first is the importance of really nailing mechanisms of change and recognising how difficult that is to do when the mechanisms of change are very abstract things like relationships, partnerships, power structures, mental mindsets. But it's a real encouragement, I think, to keep thinking, keep trying, try harder in doing that. And the other thing I think, and I think Sylvia referred to this as well, is that in this area of work, even more than in any other area of work, it's so important to keep thinking about your own positionality. As an evaluator, you're just never an independent bystander when it comes to working around place-based working. And I think, the evaluation becomes part of the context, it becomes part of the programme of work, it becomes part of the intervention. And so I think this really encourages us to think about where are we in this? Why are we there? Why aren't we in other places? How does that relate to the skills we have, the beliefs we have about how change happens, and about the role of evidence in that? What is it that holds problems in place? What are our views around that? And, you know, so again, another message that's really emphasised in the report is the importance of evidence approaches that are aligned with the values and the ethos and the spirit of different initiatives. So, you know, we will continue to, we're just starting to use this in our work. We'll continue to do that. We'll do it with creativity and curiosity, which I think is exactly as you're inviting us to do, John, to use it as a sport and not as a straitjacket, and to keep coming back to that question of, if your question is what evidence is needed to do and to understand place-based working, then your answer has to be evidence that's aligned with your views about how change happens. So it's a terrific report. I really, really commend it to everybody, and massive congratulations to you, John, and to your colleagues in pulling off something so impressive and useful.
Thank you, Jane. That's really helpful. And again, I think that for your kind of comments on focusing on, you know, what really makes change happen is exactly what I think is the essence of what the value here is, that and the kind of where we want the mind shifts to go, that we're not just looking classically at outcomes and impacts in the way that's so frustrating in this work, that it either takes too long or you can't attribute one thing to, you know, a significant to a change that you're looking to see, but it's focusing in on those things that really do create change and getting better at doing them, which I think is in the imaginary conversation I sometimes have in my head with boards of trustees to say, if you're blending this, how can we persuade you to perhaps take a different lens on value? It's that kind of, you know, putting that focus and on those mechanisms is a kind of a huge leap forward. So I'm not sure that's what you said, but that's what I take from it. Steph, let me invite you to come in and just reflect a little bit on your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Jo. So as Jo mentioned, I kind of have looked at this through two different lenses. So primarily as a previous practitioner of this work, as Sylvia said, it helps us to think about who we are and what we do. I think in large part practitioners rely on a kind of, or have previously relied on an intuition about that. But the taxonomy really scratched an itch in my brain about how I frame the thinking about that role and how best to communicate about and advocate for what we do, particularly in that backbone function. I think for a while there, that kind of like backbone role became a bit of a dirty word. It was seen as organisations kind of funding themselves rather than funding delivery this work, when actually this helps us to advocate for the importance of that role and understand what the mechanisms of change around that really look like. What I wanted to do in more detail was just talk about, in my current role of Place Matters, how we might use the taxonomy in our future work. So the typologies have been really useful for us to help us think about who we work with and to better understand how we can contribute to and deepen the learning and understanding around how change happens in place, essentially. And when we sat down and looked at the categories as an organisation, we realised that we work primarily with projects that sit between category 2, so that's civil society organisation-led change, and category 3, the state and civil society relations. We suspect when we get on the ground, as you've mentioned, John, it might not be as neat as those kind of categories. There might be organisations who straddle a couple of those categories. And we also have a hunch that in order for category 3 to exist, it necessitates the existence of category 1 and 2 as well. So we expect to kind of see some of that complexity play out on the ground as we start to dig into this. As part of our ambition for the next 3 years, we'd already committed to spending time getting closer to people and organisations on the ground who are doing this work. And we decided to kind of use this taxonomy to frame those visits. We currently do a lot of work at that funder and policy level, and we really wanted to connect a little bit closer to the work on the ground. So we plan to do 3 things on these visits to organisations doing this work to take this place and evidence project to the next level. So the first one is to stress test the taxonomy, actually. So to start to see how it plays out in reality to see where projects or organisations or functions sit within it. So where we think they might sit and where those people doing the work feel like they might themselves sit within it. And this will help us to explore any obvious omissions in the taxonomy, to challenge our own assumptions. As Jane alluded to, we should be doing constantly our own positionality, and to develop an understanding of the utility of this work within the sector. Secondly, Jane also mentioned the importance of nailing the mechanisms of change. So this will help us to deepen our understanding of those mechanisms in each of those categories that enable effective place-based initiatives. And then thirdly, to explore how organisations are using evidence to demonstrate impact. So that's the natural progression of this work, is to develop the evidential practice framework, albeit we will be focused on category 2 and 3. But I know that John and Michael are in the process of exploring how they might deepen the research against each of the categories. And so this is our contribution to that. There is, if you spend time in or around this sector, you will know that there is a growing national interest in supporting communities to lead the change that they need, with both government and funders recognising the value of locally driven approaches. Recent policy changes and changes to how funders are focusing more of their investment into place-based initiatives is proof of that shift. The developments are significant for us in the sector. They present an opportunity to shape the future of how resources are directed into communities, and to strengthen the infrastructure that supports that local change. Again, John, you referred to the kind of supply and demand. It seems as though the demand for this work is increasing now, pretty rapidly, and we just need to make sure as a sector that the supply is grounded in evidence and it's impactful, and so on. If as a sector we fail to contribute our evidence and experience to this, then the shift towards place-based initiatives risks leaving critical decisions shaped by incomplete understanding, as we've seen that play out time and again. So through the project that Place Matters plans to undertake, we seek to better understand what communities need to make and sustain change over the long term. So what capabilities, resources, structures, and mechanisms are proven most effective, and in what contexts, and also how organisations are evidencing and communicating the story of change emerging from their work and their place. So we plan to start these visits in the new year with backbone infrastructure organisations or functions, as Sylvia described, given the urgency with which we need to better understand and evidence what they do to capitalise on the funding and policy shifts that we're seeing. So if you are on this webinar today, this is a rallying cry. If you think that sounds like something your organisation does, or a function that you play, then please do get in touch with one of the Place Matters team, as we would be thrilled to set up one of those visits. We want to make sure that the visits are mutually beneficial, not just extractive. And so following our visit, we hope to produce case studies that the organisations are welcome to use. And you will also be invited, if you are not already, to participate in our learning events with our national network. And then finally, the findings will be compiled and shared with policymakers and funders to strengthen the case for the investment in the communities. So hopefully look forward to meeting many of you in person in the new year. And thank you, John, for the work. It's really valuable.
Thank you, Steph. Yeah, so I think that was just by way of talking a little bit about how Place Matters want to kind of deepen and build on the framework. John, let me invite you, first of all, perhaps just to reflect on the reflections a little bit, and also perhaps talk about, because you hinted at the start about ideas about how we take this forward. Why don't we start with perhaps you just sharing a little bit on how you see this work being developed here on in.
Thanks, Joe, and yeah, thank you, Sylvia, Jane, and Steph. It's very kind of all of you, what you've said. I was delighted to hear a number of things in what people said, particularly Sylvia talking about the role of this in really centering some of the questions that come up from contribution analysis, really encouraging us to think about what our role is in these place-based systems, and not trying to overclaim, but trying to genuinely understand what we all do and what we bring. And as Steph pointed out, if you are an organisation that maybe uses a category 3 like approach, you're probably doing some of that on the back of lots of local community stuff that sort of sits within the category 1 kind of approaches, and maybe a better understanding of that would really help build the relationships and quality there. You know, there's whole loads of things that I think flow from that contribution way of thinking that I'm really glad has kind of picked up here. And also, we went back and forth with backbones as to where to put them, how to understand them. Are they are they something different? And so we put them where we put them, but you're absolutely right to pick at that as to whether that's there's something about that approach which crosses so many of the other mechanisms, and I think it's just worth bearing that in mind. And Jane knows that only too well from things like Thrive at Five, like some of the things that they do, that it does cross many of the kind of categories that we're talking about here. I'm really pleased to hear that there's a kind of focus on, Jane, you said it, but that, Michael said to us all through this process, how does change get into the body? How does change get into the body? Like over and, like every time we looked at an example of place-based work, how does change actually get into the body? So that alignment between mechanism and evidence is exactly what we wanted to kind of center from this work. And I think what that does point to is the kind of risk of this moment that you talked about, Steph. Whilst those of us that care about place-based approaches and think that they could be hugely beneficial for our communities and etc., and ways of working, ways of achieving public policy wins, like the risk of this level of interest is that it's done badly. That we scale up stuff, or we throw resource at approaches that aren't as high quality as some of the many things that we know in this space. And that's after 2 years, a quick response for government to be able to say, oh, it doesn't work if you devolve money and resources to places. It doesn't work if we've got all these policy agendas that were all about local and neighborhood and community. And look, nothing's happened. And I think all of the people in this webinar and the broader set to the Place Matters is kind of helping support and convene. We need to think about raising our standard to meet this moment, because if we get it wrong, then it'll be an easy win for Treasury to be, no, let's just do it, let's push back to siloed budgets again. And I think that, what some of the work that we did when we were coding examples was to see, like, we couldn't work out how change gets into the body. We couldn't see what that approach was really doing. And, we started to talk about those as vibes-based, place-based work. It's like it used all the language of engagement and listening and a lot of the values that is essential to doing place-based work, but we couldn't actually see a mechanism underneath it. And it felt like it was absorbing time and capacity from a community, but not leading to change. And I think that's something that I fear a little, particularly when the terminology becomes a bit ubiquitous in the sector. Then everyone starts to claim that they work in a place-based way, and that can be dangerous to the high quality practice that does exist. So it's really wonderful to hear that, and great to hear that Place Matters are pushing on with it in the way they are. What we are interested in doing is two things. One is to go further into the research. There's a bunch of questions that it immediately poses for each of these categories, to start to build something that looks a little bit more like a playbook. Now, I'm nervous of pushing that too hard, but if you feel like when you look at your community that you're really centering an asset-based approach to category 2, well then, what are 5 other examples out there that are doing it? How do they think about evidence? When you break that mechanism down, what's particular to that asset-based approach? What are some evidentiary approaches that they've used? What are the risks that those organizations, so again, not to say do this, but to say, if you're thinking about this, here's some deeper work on that individual mechanism, because I think and how can that push into those questions of evidence? We would like to do that. And we think that in the process of doing that, that will also pose some, I remember a few years ago, it's probably more than a few years ago now, the Youth Futures Foundation, when they were looking at NEETs, unemployed young people issues across the UK, they did a really good and interesting piece of work on kind of gap analysis for evidence. And I think if you start pushing into these mechanisms, what that will probably allow us to do is, as a field, start to see some gap analysis. Like, actually, we don't know anything about how this category works after year 5. We don't know anything we make these claims about sustainability, but we've got no evidence on this. And if we're going to push that into, that we need to bulk up our quality, I think there will be some evidentiary questions for the field that can't be answered by any one particular organization. or one particular type of practice. And I think I'm really interested in using this framework as a way to look at both those mechanistic, going deeper questions, and then in doing so, getting a better idea of where the gaps are in our field of understanding. There's a few other things that we're interested in doing as well around like the debate and how the language that flows from this can be used by people who aren't just evidence-based practitioners, who are thinking about delivery, who are thinking about policy and influence at government levels, who are thinking about fundraising, who are, how you use this language to get to kind of raise the quality of everything an organization does, and how can that then allow us to grow this field. So there's a number of things that Anna and Michael and I are thinking about next. We're really keen to work with Place Matters on what they're doing to make sure that we're, the last thing that this field of practice needs is kind of too much distracted noise. What we need to do is make sure we're aligning to support the growth of really good stuff. And so how we work with Place Matters, how we work with people like Jane, who are doing the evaluations, who are like the edge of understanding how outcomes are achieved through this kind of work. And so that's what we want to do next. And we'd be delighted to continue to talk to anyone really in this webinar who's interested in pushing that on.
Yeah, thank you, John. Lots to do. There's a few questions in the Q&A which I just want to make sure we give a few minutes to, if that's all right with everybody. I'm going to try and group a couple of them just so we're sort of covering the bases. There's a question around what good evidence looks like, and I know that's a very big question, and it's going to be, it depends. But are there Kate asks, is there any particular features of either the supply or demand side of place change that informs what I'm guessing as we mean, Kate, around what good evidence looks like? I don't know whether John, you or Jane, or indeed Sylvia would want to respond to any of that. But I think, yeah, just a little bit more about are there any generalities to or things that you got from the work that give you an insight into the nature of good evidence?
So at risk of kind of repeating Jane's point of the evidence needs to align to the mechanism, I think it's that, and then it is also making sure that everyone who is part of the absorption of that evidence generation, so the funders, the stakeholders, know that that's what you're going after. Because the worst examples of this type of scene is a funder invests in something, and it could be a governmental funder or a private philanthropic, or all kinds of funders invest in something, and the group or the community or the organization says, right, we do this, but they feel like they have to claim, and it achieves this off the back of it, and then everyone gets caught up in the and it achieves this bit of that evidence debate. And of course we're all interested in what it achieves, of course we are, but I think if you get caught there, then you end up missing the point. And what that tends to do is it devalues. So when you ask questions of what good evidence is, it devalues a whole range of types of evidence. So I think in this country we devalue a number of types of evidence in terms of voice, narrative, and experience. But we also devalue things like, I don't know, social network analysis. We don't see like rigorous changes to social networks as being good evidence, whereas actually if you're really serious about some of these mechanisms, then it should be. But no one thinks they want to invest money in shifting social networks, whereas actually a lot of the background research says that's exactly what you should be interested in shifting. So I think there's that mismatch where we all unintentionally get caught up in the and it achieves this bit of the conversation rather than the what's the mechanism bit of the conversation. And just that shift means that we start to code different types of evidence as being more rigorous than others. And I think all types of evidence can be rigorous if they're rigorous. But the definition of rigorous is different for the type of evidence, rather than one type is more rigorous than another type. But I'm sure Jane and Sylvia have got lots to say on that.
Sylvia, please come in.
I think one of the things that I'm really, really struck by and wondering if you need to make more explicit collectively is that most people are operating in an organizationally driven paradigm. And that in fact, there's an assumption that you've all made that maybe needs to be made explicit, that real progress on these complex types of issues actually is beyond the scope or scale of any one organization or group to achieve on their own. And that therefore, you're actually using more of an ecosystem or field paradigm in the mapping of how change happens. And therefore, what you're looking for or tracking in terms of outcomes is by its very nature then going to look different than traditional evaluation of a program. So I think making that distinction is going to be really important in sort of framing out whatever you ultimately choose to track. But I'm thinking of a number of different initiatives that we've worked with and seen. Tracking outcome wins is one. So yeah, so what outcomes have been achieved for the key targets or recipients of whatever the action is about? What insight wins have been achieved in terms of how are we now understanding the dynamics nature of an issue like poverty, for example? What are the capacity wins that have been achieved, either for people of that place or, because that's a legacy or sustainable impact that will remain regardless of what a particular effort is focused on, because that gets at what I think you're talking about, which is the social network analysis piece, right? The relationships, the degree of trust that's growing, and that community sense that we can actually come together, work well together, and make meaningful impact on stuff we care about. And then I think the last one might be tracking those system level shifts or wins that you've contributed to in terms of things like those 6 conditions of systems change, which I think just make the notion of systems change more concrete and tangible and therefore observable, right? Things like practice changes across partners, things like policy changes, whether they're organizational or legislative, things like information flows shifting or funding flows. Then you're getting into power dynamics and you're getting into those relationships. And then ultimately, how has or have attitudes and behaviors shifted in terms of either the broader community or across different practitioners and players affected by whatever the issue is.
That's really helpful, and I think that so I think the sort of the top line narrative is if all of this is incredibly important if we can demonstrate that they are really the putting change into the body of the work, and that's the kind of the big shift. Thank you for that. I think there's a couple of questions around who do we need to bring with us on this journey, and how do we create a kind of a coalition of practice that enables us to kind of shift this way of thinking. I don't know whether Jane or John, you've got any thoughts about how we might do that in the UK, or who we might need to bring with us and how we might do that.
Well, I mean, gosh, big question. Very broadly, I guess anyone that we want to do something differently as a result of this, so that's going to be funders who need to really sort of richly understand what they might be able to say about what their money has created or led to. Sylvia's just put that absolutely beautifully, so I won't go through that, but we need funders who will understand the real nature of change that can emerge from place-based working. We need local people to be involved in it. We need local organisations in the state system and in the public system and in the private system, and we need national government to be involved in this, I think, partly because they're important funders of it, partly because they're important users of it, and partly because quite often what happens when you're trying to create change in place is that you hit against barriers that come from national government, particularly from national policy and from national funding streams. And so I think national government needs to be brought in as part of what might need to change to help this work to really to really flourish. And so work like the work that Steph described, and the work of Place Matters is just tremendously important, I think, in helping to bring those organisations together and to really sort of surface where there are tensions, where there are differences, where we're all coming with different expectations, different assumptions, and different starting positions, and really lean in and try to kind of nut it out.
Yeah, I mean, I just very quickly just really agree with that, and that's part of, when I was saying that there's two things we want to do. One is going deeper in the research, and one is sort of thinking about who else. I think it's getting place-based work out of being a minority sport for those that like place-based work, and trying to show as many people as possible, no, this is what you're interested in. There's a very, there's a shift in a range of ways in the UK public policy conversation, and probably in other countries too, where some are talking about more relational practice or more human practice or more more devolved practice, or part of public service reform needs to be this kind of, and I think a lot of what they all share is a view that the way in which we're currently working isn't working. And they each emphasize something a little differently. So some might say system change is the thing, some might say place is the thing, some might say relational working is the thing. But fundamentally, that diagram would have lots of overlap. And I think, but the only way we're going to get that out of being a minority sport is to make sure that more people see the value of place-based change and those other approaches in their whole job. So whether that's to Sylvia's point of, you've got to get it out of the organization of the program and get it into the system that you're trying to influence. You've got to get it out of just the delivery team and into the policy team as well as the fundraising team. And you've got to get it conversations out of just thinking, oh, I need to persuade the government minister, to actually think, like, Pride in Place is already out in the field. If we're going to ensure that Pride in Place money is spent in high quality ways, it's local government, it's combined authorities, it's VCSE partners across those communities. And so, in the UK, we've got these wins at the moment of greater interest, but all that does is it diffuses the range of people that we need to engage with.
Yeah, thank you. One final question from and I'm pick and mixing here, so apologies everybody, just trying to be fair on the balance of questions. But I think your framework really enticingly takes us to the right of more emergent practice around, some of the kind, I can't remember what you term it now, John, but the kind of more infrastructure, big, wicked issue kind of thing. Could you talk a little bit more around where you see the demand going? Are we in the UK trying to shift practice from left to right? And if so, what might that look like, do you think, assuming that's the case? John, you're on mute.
Sorry, it had to happen once, didn't it? I'll answer that around combined authorities in the UK, because I think that's when you think about what this government has done, it's got targeted money for things like Pride in Place. It's got policy wins for things like neighbourhood hubs for Better Start, or for NHS teams. But then it's also got governance change. And so the kind of devolution bill around the combined authority tier, the local government reorganisation, and what it looks like at that next tier down. And it's currently being debated in Parliament at the moment, but the kind of the community governance level. But so much of the energy of devolution sits with combined authorities. And I think that's the scale where some of the more interesting questions are going to be asked and answered. Of how does that regional scale relate to neighbourhood? And what then is the role of regional government in relation to local government in relation to neighbourhood? How are we going to get that working? And my suspicion is that's where some of the most interesting practice, one, already is. So Steph's old organisation, Right to Succeed, does a lot of work with combined authorities and the relationship between neighbourhood, local, and combined authority. So one where a lot of that energy already is. I talked about Live Well in Greater Manchester, the Fair Education Alliance, working with combined authorities on thinking about how they can work at this neighbourhood to national policy that they've got, and looking at neighbourhood through to regional working in combined authority. So I think that's where it's going to be. And I think that's going to push us to think more critically about when we first started articulating our category 4, which is this kind of market intervention, regeneration, shifting, a lot of people are like, that's not place-based work. Like, because in the UK, typically it's been quite top-down. I think the regional tier allows us to think more expansively about, actually, it doesn't have to be centre going down. It can be about what's the role of regions? How can you pull a lever at the regional scale and that influence micro and neighbourhood scale things, and vice versa? And I think people that I've spoken to at combined authorities, they're interested in that role, they're interested in how to do that work. And so I think that's going to be a super exciting area for exploration, resource, and some thinking. You know, well, as with all things, it could go wrong, but I think there's lots of potential there.
Thank you for that. Well, I think that sort of speaks to the kind of next layer of this work, is what does it mean for me? What does it mean for the different sort of layers of this work to bring that alive, and some of the case study work and other things. Thank you all. There were other Q&A questions, but hopefully I've covered the main bases in grouping some of those. So apologies, but I've left some of those out. In the last couple of minutes before we let you go, we just wanted to invite you just to participate in a very short poll, which we're going to put on Slido. And I'm now going to do what I couldn't do before, is share my screen with the Slido details on it. With the thing, it's not being very helpful at the moment to me. So, oh yes, we go. Just put that on screen share, apologies. Share. If you can see that and your QR code is playing ball, could you, there's a couple of questions in it. There's one, there's a multiple choice to tick on how this might be useful in your work, just to get a sense from you as an audience on where this lands. And the second question is, how can we sort of take it forward? So if you would take a minute or two just to fill that in, we'd be really grateful, and then we'll share the results if we get enough time in the next minute before we close. And while you're doing that, I'll just really by way of closing, say to thank John, Michael and Anna again for what was a modest budget and an epic effort. I think it's fair to say. You certainly chewed up a hell of beats of thinking there, but thank you, because it was an act of generosity on your part to do such amount of heavy lifting. It went above and beyond what we hoped for, and it's created a platform, a really solid platform now to develop the work going forward. To Sylvia, Jane, and Steph for just sharing their thoughts and reflections generously and their thoughts. And to you, please in the chat. Because we'll keep the chat. If you have an interest, as some of you have said, in the case study work or participating in some way in the development of this work, please just put something in the chat to that effect. And you know, we're all about creating networks and carrying on conversations around this. So please indicate your interest, and we'll be looking at how we sort of take this work forward in the various ways that it will go. And thank you very much for coming along. I'm going to hand over to Steph just to say, just to talk a bit about the results coming in just to share those before we close.
All I can say is they're coming in, but I can't see them.
Right.
So tech issues have failed us again, but we can share those maybe afterwards.
We'll share those in the, yeah. What we normally do is we'll share the recording and then any sort of material notes. So what we'll do is we'll just write up the results then of what you said in those notes. So thought, yeah, tech's not been with us being very friendly with us today. We'll just share those. Just stop sharing. So thank you everyone, and for coming along, and we shall